everybody talks about doing things differently. We want something different. We want something different. And then they go back to the same, the same situation or the same scenario.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, I think, when teams give things a try, right? But everybody has to have that buy-in, right? We're going to go down this road. Your jobs are secure, but this is what we're going to try. And I think sometimes it's even as basic as you've chosen a platform, you've invested all this money. So we'll just say it's HubSpot, for instance, right? And so now you have these teams that are in working, but you have no one that is well versed in HubSpot. Okay, it's a platform, most people can get it. But then who are you going to tag with this is your baby? You need to make sure that dashboards are set up right, that automation, flows are done properly, where the trigger points are. You have to have somebody, and I have a very close friend who's working with a company, no clue, no clue. All this money, again, going into it. And, she's told them, okay. So finally she got them to get the assessment, get somebody in there to set everything up. But you're right. Sometimes it has to get so bad, like so bad where you're bleeding money.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the eMarketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super excited to chat today with Christine Magda, who helps clients work through their marketing strategies and marketing execution. And so one of the things we'll start off with is one thing I've noticed, it's sort of always been the case, is like on the B2B level, even more than B2C, the sales and marketing teams get so excited with like chasing down the new leads and chasing down the new business that they sort of forget about nurturing, and they also forget about LTV. And one thing I noticed from having had conversations with you previously is you really like to get in there and remind the companies and remind the C-suite, like, wait a minute, like there's a life cycle, right? And so you can't just focus on the next shiny object from a lead gen perspective or the next new prospect or the next new customer. You have to be more holistic. So I'd love to hear, like, do you see that happening as often as I am, where like people don't always have the holistic focus?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Kevin. Super excited to be a part of this today. And you're right, I do have a lot to a lot to say about this. I find that because of the pressures put on, I guess the new leads. It's always lead gen. You look at job description after job description. It's lead gen, demand gen, lead gen, demand gen. Two different things. Sometimes they get very convoluted. And I think that there is more of a longer term look now, especially mid-sized, larger companies, in terms of looking at the life cycle or customer journey, client journey. It's become such a buzzword that's almost now, I think, on its way out. Not the concept,
Yeah.
just using the buzzwords. So I think that although leads are always going to be, and I think this goes to the way things are set up. It's kind of like you almost are still in an old school world where it's just leads, and they don't realize that leads don't lead most often to revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And since at the end of the day, sales and marketing and everybody else for that matter is tagged with revenue, it's not a smart methodology, to keep today. Sure, you need leads, but how are you improving what leads are coming in the door? So I'm seeing more of a balance of, especially from the marketing side. Sales are always going to be told, just bring it in. But from a marketing side, I think this is part with the proliferation of data from everywhere. And I think now marketers are more going back to the C-suite and saying, we have to do more than just have leads. We need this longer term life cycle type of client coming through the door. And this is how you do it.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. Often when I come in with my team, with a prospect who calls us in and says, we're doing B2B marketing and we need help. We need, a better media mix or marketing mix, including earned media as well. Often we'll say, well, we need to know a little bit more about, what do your top decile of clients look like? What do your top quartile of clients look like? How do those look different from each other? And what about the bottom, like the clients you would probably prefer to fire? Like, what do they look like? And what did they look like when they were leads? And what about the time frame of like between when they lead and they become a sale? Is there a difference in sort of the sales cycle and how long it takes? And often they don't have the back end business intelligence to answer that question, right?
Yeah.
Because as marketers who are sort of in charge of anywhere between upper funnel down to lower funnel, but getting the business in the door, getting at least the leads in the door, like we know not every lead is created equal, right? And that's not just from the Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross side of like closing them. It's about the much broader thing about, well, at an LTV level, how are these different from each other? And so when you get called in on a strategic basis to help marketers and C-suite folks with that, do you also find the situation where there's a whole bunch of sort of digital transformation that has to happen where they could even get to the data to know what their best customers look like and what makes their best customers similar to each other?
Far too often. And it's almost as if you wonder why they're even organized the way that they're organized, because it's siloed, right? There's no or very little. And it can even just be within one department, including, my favorite, marketing, right? Where you ask them about their positioning and their competitors and what they look like and the top, sometimes about three. Do you know three that you can just say off the top that I can do some research on? Or do you have any, no, no, it doesn't. It's like, it's almost as if it doesn't matter, but it does matter, and
Right.
that's part of the challenge of, well, why weren't you talking to client success about this? I mean, a recent client had such terrible case studies. They weren't case studies. Like, no one's going to look at that, but they had so many fantastic studies buried within their team. I mean, the statistics were phenomenal and all the data was showing that. Well, why aren't you sharing this information? Like, why isn't so? Again, it goes back to, I think there's just a disconnect. There's no one centrally responsible for what's going on internally and making sure that product updates and product, not just the buzzwords of it, right? Rebranding, when a company acquires a couple of different, companies, whose responsibility is that? So that everyone on your sales, biz dev, rev teams understand the implication of these additional and how they can cross sell, upsell.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just left just out there, like it's going to magically happen. And it's baffling to me because smaller companies can do it, and you figured they're new, especially startups,
Mm-hmm.
but they even seem to have a better, clearer view than the midsize, which seem to really somehow or other along the path lost their way. And I don't know if it's, everybody's kind of vying for their role and they want to keep everything to themselves. But you look at statistics and time again, you see where it's, there's data breaks all the time, or there's just exactly how you spelled it out. You don't know who your competition is. You don't know why your top clients are your top clients and the reasons why. Why isn't somebody taking those reasons and creating even more content to create even more demand to go along that cycle? And it's disconnect, right? It's just a disjoint.
Right. The way you describe it, though, it sounds like it might be difficult unless it comes right from the C-suite, it might be difficult to fix, right? Because you do have these silos, you do have these political fiefdoms, you do have this momentum where everybody understands what their job responsibilities are, even if they're the wrong ones. But if they're just this momentum, right? in this mid-sized organization, which may have evolved without the strategy behind it. And now they don't even realize it's broken, but then you basically come in there and say, oh, by the way, it seems like this is sort of broken. We need to fix it, right? But some of those people might not want it fixed, or might not feel comfortable with it being fixed, or might worry that they're the ones who end up with the pink slips if it gets fixed.
Right.
So has there been any consistency with like how you go in there and sort of advise the senior management, like, okay, we have a problem, we have to fix it, but it's might not be easy, right? Because people hate change, the inertia is there.
Right. And that is usually the biggest problem. And I guess if from the top they understand it and they can see, oh wow, okay, you're right. Like I can see where you have this. And now we're just going to have to go through some headaches, but it might take longer than, but at least they're willing. They see it, they see the problem as well. That in that case, sometimes it's the push, or between like tech and marketing, and what tech wants you to have, but what marketing is saying, I don't need that. What I need is X, Y, and Z, right? So I've seen this happen where it was a nonprofit group that I was working with. They're in the education space. They had more platforms, Salesforce, Pardot, Marketing Cloud. Okay, their clients were not in that world. They wanted them to maintain and update their database. Wasn't ever going to happen. Now, unfortunately, in this situation, my access to the CEO, I had direct access to the CRO, wasn't enough that I could say, and I like their tech team, but they had their walls up, and some of the nonsense and the bureaucracy, I couldn't believe it was even happening. You know what I mean? Like it was that much where you can see it so clearly, and you think, you're spending all of this money, you have such redundancy, and you're not using at least 50 to 60% of the capabilities of this powerful platform. Like this is ridiculous. And then they couldn't segment, and then they were not getting things right, and they just spiral. In this case, it's a nonprofit. So you know what? They just, let's stay on an even path. And in that situation, what are you going to do, right? Like they're not for profit. They're not listening or, answering to a board, but they're not answering to a PE or a VC company. It's a totally different, ball game. But in situations where it is imperative, I think you're absolutely right. It's easier for me as a consultant to go in there and to say this. And it's never about, for me, I shouldn't say never, but 90% of the time, it's never about, oh, we need to cut here, we need to cut jobs. It's about reorging. It's about aligning. It's so simple when somebody from above will lead, right? And somebody says, this is the way this looks like. And I think, part of the problem is marketers, as well as other teams, they've always kind of gotten the side swipe as this is a secondary or an assisted position, right? And I always look at it as it's not, it's the hub, right? It is, and I'd love to hear what CEOs, COOs, CROs, and director level and VP level, what people think about that. Because I honestly am confused if every aspect under the marketing umbrella touches every aspect of the business, why wouldn't it be a critical hub, or like the filter of a Brita, right? I mean, I don't understand like why that process isn't all centralized through that. It just, and time again, I see this. So I'm trying to create this AI project that I've mentioned to you before, and maybe through diagrams and through multi AI platforms, giving data that somehow or other that'll open the conversation a little bit more.
Right. Well, you mentioned PE firms, and that reminded me that we do a fair amount of work for PE firms, both on the pre-acquisition due diligence, where we go in there and identify the problems, both from a weakness perspective, but also from an upside evaluation, right? Because part of it is about sort of fixing what's broken. The other part of it is, well, if we were to hit the gas after fixing what's broken, how high is up, right?
Okay.
And it's after those deals get done by the PE firms, it's almost like management, whether or not they're the same management or not, suddenly feel this mandate for change, right? Where they may not have felt the mandate under the previous cap table. And it's strange that it often requires that to be the wake-up call for the organization, right? That somebody else needs to own it or own most of it or own enough of it to make a difference. I guess in the public markets, maybe it's the activist investor who's the sort of
Right.
equivalent, who gets themselves on the board and shakes things up, right? But it seems like it often requires a catalyst, a fairly significant catalyst, right? To change that, to wake everybody up and shake things loose and have things be reevaluated.
That's a great point. And a great win for the investor in this
Yeah.
case, right? Because
Yeah.
instead of them being these raiders, it just makes sense because they're coming in and showing them, hey, this is not working and this could work. And I think you're right about, the pink slips. Everybody talks about doing things differently. We want something different, we want something different, and then they go back to the same situation or the same scenario.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, I think, when teams give things a try, right? But everybody has to have that buy-in, right? We're going to go down this road. Your jobs are secure, but this is what we're going to try. And I think sometimes it's even as basic as you've chosen a platform, you've invested all this money. So we'll just say it's HubSpot, for instance, right? And so now you have these teams that are in working, but you have no one that is well versed in HubSpot. Okay, it's a platform, most people can get it. But then who are you going to tag with this is your baby? You need to make sure that dashboards are set up right, that automation, flows are done properly, where the trigger points are. You have to have somebody, and I have a very close friend who's working with a company. No clue. No clue. All this money, again, going into it. And, she's told them, okay. So finally, she got them to get the assessment, get somebody in there to set everything up. But you're right. Sometimes it has to get so bad, like so bad where you're bleeding money.
Yeah.
What, you don't have many choices here. So, yeah, it's, it's I don't know. I mean, what do you run into with that? Like, where do you find most of the walls are put up when
Yeah,
it
I
comes
think
to
we it depends on the philosophy of management. I think has a lot to do with it because whenever we take on a new engagement, which is more than often not an agency of record, right? Usually we go in as a SWAT team because they felt the pain on something. They may have felt the pain on paid search or paid social or organic SEO, which is a huge pain point now due to AI and what's happening there. So that tends to be a really hot biz dev area for us. But we're often going in and evaluating that. And then whether it's paid media or earned media, folks want a punch list, right? They want a sort of prioritization list with things in a specific set of orders. And what we find is often sort of a discussion point that's really important is how quickly will we see results in relationship to how much lift we'll get, right?
right,
Because there may be low-hanging fruit that's super easy, but only delivers like 6% lift on some important KPI. But it's just so easy
right,
that it's like an easy win. Like, oh, let's just go in and do that one because to some extent that proves the case. Like, oh, we did the audit, we identified the area for improvement, we did the simple thing, and look, wow, instant free money as a result
yeah,
of that, right?
yep,
Whereas certain other things, in particular earned media things like SEO and content marketing and certain forms of social media, like you could be 6 months to a year before you see any movement there. Does that mean you don't do it? Well, that would be silly because then, that category in particular, SEO is a marathon, not a sprint. but then having that punch list and helping the senior team think through, including sometimes the CFO, right? Like think through, okay, well, we haven't invested in SEO for 4 years. Well, that's probably a problem. You know, you're going to have to hit the gas extra hard now if you don't want to be irrelevant in the next, algorithmic update, right? So, but that's a big decision to make, right? So, along with that, if you can have certain easy wins or other ways to frame it, that can be super important. So, to go back to a point that you made, actually, like, getting more testimonials, getting the good stories out there that are already there. They're just buried, they're hidden, nobody surfaced them, right? That's the kind of content that works really well, not just for improving your rank in a Google search engine result as you publish that stuff out and it starts to rank, but it also future proofs your SEO with AI, because the LLMs can come in and ingest that content and start to realize, wow, this company makes the best bubblegum wrapping machine out there. We didn't know, right? But now we know, and if anybody happens to ask that, we can give the answer, or we can give sort of a modified SERP if you think about sort of some of Perplexity and some of the new search engines that are AI driven, right? So that's not so hard, right, to find those success stories, nor is it particularly hard to go take co-marketing partners and co-create content with them. But
Right.
if nobody's assigned to do it, it won't happen, right?
Right.
So somebody needs to come in there and guide them and add it to the to-do list and do the editorial calendaring and whatever, and become sort of the owner of that in the same way that somebody becomes the owner of the HubSpot instance, right? Or the owner of the Salesforce instance or whatever other tech you're using. So I think we're seeing a lot of that, especially in an era of marketing austerity, right? Where people are like, I need to do more with less. So given that I have less to work with, I really need to have a very good understanding of exactly what everything is delivering.
Right. Well, and that's a great point, the austerity. It's amazing. And I don't know that every marketer will be happy that I'm saying this out loud, but it's what I find, again, because it's connected to every aspect, almost every aspect of a company, right? It is really important to be able to go to these team leads or someone on these various teams in order to make sure that you're getting the right information collected in order to disseminate that, whether you're doing just for the first awareness acquisition level, or if it's all the way back, down the funnel of you're creating LTV for people, but here's how we're keeping them, right? And it's through that content, it's through repurposing that content. But a lot of that content is coming from your client services team, right? And their feedback, the likes, the dislikes. It's also coming from your product and engineering team, right? This is what we're looking to create. This is what we have done. This is what it does. But if your client is telling you that's not what we're using it for, it doesn't work like that, but this is what we love it for, well, you better make sure that your messaging is reflecting that. And then you have the complexities. And again, marketing, I think, is responsible for this, at least on the more macro level of, you have buying committees, especially on B2B side, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have a committee of buyers. Sometimes the CFO does jump in because, okay, what you need, or what we need, is going to be a big outlay, right? And we have only this much budgeted, or, and then you also need their data science team, and then you also need their CMO, or their VP of marketing. So you need to be able to speak to them at each of their levels, at least at each of their buying needs. And that message, even though your brand is your brand, it's nuanced. That message is nuanced. It's not this, you're not talking the same thing. Well, who does that? Essentially, that is one of the many roles of someone in marketing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Whether it's the product marketer that really shoulders a lot of all of that, or it's a combo of comms and product marketing and content marketing. It depends, again, on the size of your org. But, even the medium-sized orgs, when they kind of pull that aside or say, oh, well, we're really going, we don't really need that. Well, who's doing that then? You think your biz dev people have the time to do that too? To get into like the buyer's mind? I mean, there's not enough time in the day, So again, even with the austerity, it can be done. Yes, it's always much better when you have, higher budgets and whatever else, but it can be done if it's structured properly within, right? Because then everybody's flowing and collaborating in these decisions.
Yeah, another thing it got me thinking down another rabbit hole, which is this idea of the leverage that you get as a result of, increased LTV or increased retention, right? Because in the end, your ability to afford media and your ability to invest in marketing is directly proportional to, from a B2B perspective, to, how valuable the client is immediately and how valuable they are over time, right? Because if they're super valuable, you can afford more to bring in people who look just like them, right?
Right.
And chief revenue officers at so many organizations, they're purely new customer focused, right? And unless there's somebody just as dedicated in making sure that the customers are delighted and that they're getting the level of value that they're paying for, you're going to end up with churn. And if you end up with churn, then you can't afford the media to buy the new customers.
That's right.
So it all really works so much in tandem because of that compound effect, right? Where if you increase your back end KPIs, it empowers your front end to be more aggressive.
Right. Right. And that's where then these longstanding brands who have stayed, the distance despite everything, it's because they do continue to do that, right? They continue, and not just only in ads, but just in value, in how people perceive them, and what it does for, buyers, again, they buy for different reasons, right? Are you doing it to be, oh, look at how great I look, or are you buying it because this makes me look really smart, or, oh, it's because it's something that I hold close to me, it means a lot, right? So what are the reasons why people are buying? But also then how, look at SaaS companies, the whole success of many of them is the whole buying and the bundling, right? The bundling effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
The magnifying effects of, when you have this, it just keeps, you can build up to it, right? Cross-selling, right. Upselling, these things all have to be thought out, right? It's just, again, like I was mentioning before, if a company acquires a couple of different other companies, 1, 2, 3, and the capabilities all fit in, and they make a larger, better, more effective machine, or whatever it may be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who and how is that being presented, right, to these additional buyers? And a lot of times, and what I found with this one company, it was interesting, their sales, client, and client services teams were a little hesitant to push some of these other capabilities, even though they fit within the marketing ecosystem, like, again, to make it a better machine for the client. But it's, they didn't want to cannibalize the business that they have, right? So who is doing that, right? You need somebody within an organization, and usually it's done through content. And when I say content, that means everything from, actual blogs and website to SERP, and, and SEO and AdWords if necessary, and things of that nature. But who's doing that then, and who's making sure it's connected, that it's one story that makes sense.
Yeah, which of course ties into the fact that whether you're a B2B brand or B2C brand, all of your various marketing messages are making a brand promise, and you better be able to fulfill upon it, right? Because no amount of media dollars or earned media publicity is going to get you where you need to go if you can't fulfill upon whatever that promise was, right?
Such
Everything
a great
is a marketing touch point.
Right.
Every
Such
customer
a
service
great
interaction.
point.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what makes me laugh, because that is the core of your company, right? The brand promise, the message, where you're positioned. But yet the average life, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe this statistic is off, but I've seen this more than many times, too many times. Like, the average lifetime or lifespan of a CMO is like 2 years. Well, why is that if they sit on top of what your brand is? Like, why are they less valuable? It just, again, it's the org. It doesn't make any sense to me. And the more I see, and this started years ago, but I didn't know enough or see enough, and that's why I'm saying I really want to hear from some of these, again, operations, rev, marketing, to what they think and what they're seeing. And if they actually take a step back, you know what, maybe that's true. And I'm not saying that they're going to replace the CEO. No, not at all. But they should have a locked in place, put it that
Yeah.
way, and not that it's like, oh, well, we don't even have marketing anymore. Like, you what? You're $100+ million company. You have no marketing. Okay.
I would love I can't remember who keeps track of that stat on the churn rate for CMOs. And clearly it is a problem. But I would love whoever does the stat, right, to actually break it down into two buckets, which is the CMOs that leave because they're so great that they're getting called in to do the same thing somewhere else, right?
Okay.
On a 2-year plan where they crush it in 2 years, versus the CMOs who left because they did the opposite of crush it. They were stagnant, or maybe even things went the opposite direction, and they were exited involuntarily, right? Because either of those things could be equally true, right? With a 2-year stint, right?
Very good point.
You could be asked to leave, or you could leave because you just got the next best job offer, right?
Yeah, very
Whereas,
true.
I think it's more difficult for other C-suite members to be in either of those two cases. Maybe CFOs, right? I mean, and where does the buck stop, right? So marketing either can take credit or get blame for a whole bunch of things outside of their control, right?
Yes.
And similarly, have an ability to, so that they can either choose to take credit or they'll get the blame. And so I think, both of those could result in the high level of churn. So I hope I'll reach out. I'll try to find out whoever does that stat and see if they can figure
Okay.
out the difference between those two, because I think that would really be informative for that stat.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right. And that makes me think of something else too, what you were just saying. What about, if they get let go, right, because they didn't perform, but at the same time, if they're not given that role, right, to make a difference, and we'll use the lowest hanging fruit, revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they're not given that open door of communication, right, so that they can actually generate that revenue that goes far beyond, like we both said, that first or second, step in the life cycle, which is acquisition. If
Mm-hmm.
it's just there, right, and then the churn, and you're just losing people, and the leaky bucket, right? It's that leaky bucket, and you're losing people. Well, why is that happening? And was that something that could have been prevented if, again, it was structured differently, that we didn't have this? And what I find in that case, and I'm seeing this quite a bit, is when the right processes are not put into place when you come through that whole automation cycle, right? And it's when and where marketing and or content, however you want to call that, handles, and when it gets turned over to sales, SDRs, BDRs, whatever they're calling them in that particular company. Because I think that's a critical point, right? Like, where and who is nurturing this, right? So sure, client services can nurture and they can do this, but who's doing, again, that upselling, cross-selling? Or who is, and a lot of times it's not the sales or biz dev or client services. Sure, they're responsible for growing the business a bit, but are they responsible for the marketing side, meaning the psychological side, why these customers will buy? No, they're again, they sell.
Yeah.
So I think, you really wonder how often they're questioned about that when a CMO is exiting, right? if a company is questioned, well, what about why are we set up like this?
Mm.
And I've dealt with this actually just really recently. Somebody who's in operations, heads up operations, and the CEO is going off on a track he does not think is good. And I said to him, this was just last week. I said to him, did you say anything to him? I'm like, well, why not? You're on your way out anyway.
Mhm.
What do you have to lose? I'm like, I'm not sure why you'd be quiet about something like this. I
Yeah.
mean, if you were afraid of a pink slip, okay, I understand. You have a family to feed, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But you're on your way out. You're winding down there. It's almost like it's your obligation. You
Yeah.
see what's going on. Why aren't you, trying to right the ship for them? I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's fascinating because again, you bring that up from the perspective of the C-suite person, potentially the CMO, who was exited, but was in an organization that was unwilling to change, and they didn't have the levers at their disposal when they were in the organization, so they could not have succeeded, right? There was
Right.
no opportunity to change that organization. As they go out and they interview for their next position, I think it would be key for them to ask the questions the next time to
Yes.
understand whether it is within their purview to make the changes that are in fact going to be most key to the success of that next company. Because even agencies, right, we don't always get an opportunity to understand the levers that are available to us as an agency when we come in and try to solve a problem for a client, right?
Right.
And we've had clients where, you lay out the punch list and whoever your internal champion is says, well, we can't change these 6 out of 9. They're just completely outside of my ability to change it. And I can try to, refer into the other departments or whatever. And then you sort of shake your head as the agency because you want the client to succeed. And you think to
Yeah.
yourself, like, well, does that mean we should have a conversation with the next level up? Like how can we get everybody walking in the same direction, get all the ducks in a row, remove the roadblocks, right, that are
Right.
there internally, because often the agency, only has their champion, and you can't really go above the champion's head, certainly not without their help,
Right.
because
Right. Exactly.
they're the ones who brought you in, right? But yet, we would love to be able to give them the ammunition to be the hero, right? Because if we can help them get those changes enacted and then the results manifest themselves, right? They're the
Yep.
hero, right?
Yep.
Because they got customer service to change this, or they got a new pricing plan implemented, which actually is 30% more, but it has extra value, right? These are things that wouldn't typically be in their roles and responsibilities. And so, as agencies, we'd love to empower them, but different organizations have a different willingness to accept, let's say, constructive criticism or
Exactly.
suggestions, right? And I
E-
think that the CMOs looking for their next gig, that's an interesting lens that they should be using to look at whether or not they should say yes, right? Obviously, to your point, they have a family to feed and a mortgage to pay, right? But knowing what you're getting yourself into might be really important if you don't want to get churned out of the organization uh, too quickly.
Right. And that's a great point. I think too often, I mean, it seems like it would be something that is just natural, right? It makes so much sense. Of course, you're going to ask these questions. But like an example I gave you a bit ago, a good friend of mine whose client, they just hired someone on as a CMO, and everything is a surprise. Everything is a surprise. And I mean, she and I laugh. I mean, this is now how we're enjoying drinks these days, because
Right.
it's just like, wow, wow. Comes in thinking one thing, completely sees under the engine, about what the reality is. And it makes you wonder, did they even ask? Right? Did they ask these important questions? Right? Did they interview this company as they're being interviewed as well? Right. And it always kind of strikes me, and I'll never forget a job I took back in, like, I think it was like 2014, and it was just coming off of a digital media company that I had founded with two other people, and we were just decided we weren't going on any further, right? We didn't want to have investors. We had dabbled in it. We lasted for 7 years. It was time, right? Too much money needed to be invested in technology, especially. And, I had joined this company, and I remember asking the CEO certain questions, and he looked at me, and I think there was a hesitation of them even hiring, because I don't think he liked the questions that I was asking. About a month and a half later, I guess they didn't find who they were actually, and they did offer me the position. But honestly, that new division that they were trying to start and those questions I was asking, they decided against it. They could have made that decision a year earlier and saved a lot of money.
Right.
And it was all because they did. No, we're not going there. Like, this money's been approved. We're doing this. We're not looking at that. So
yeah, I've seen that work both directions as well. So where things, there's opportunity cost and then there's wasted budget, right? And they're equally dangerous to the organization. It's what you didn't do that should have done, and then there's what you did do that you shouldn't have done.
Right. Right. And which happens a lot with startups that are heavily, invested in and funded, right? Because then they've got this runway, and it's the pandemic, curse, right? Everybody's like, oh my gosh, look at all this money coming in. We're hiring. Where do you think that it's just going to be a never ending, free flow? I don't know.
Yeah, there's some wake up calls going on throughout the venture funded industry, B2B in particular, because sales cycles are lengthening and everything. But I'm sure we could actually talk for another 2 or 3 hours on this stuff. But we'll have to do a separate follow-up podcast, perhaps make it more narrowly focused of what we talk about. But thanks so much for joining me, Christine. This was really fun, and I think we touched on a lot of things that marketing managers, from manager up to CMO and maybe even CEO, can learn from.
Well, thank you. It was great fun.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.